Reset.
Right. I think we might be live. It took a few minutes to get that figured out. We had to restart my computer and OBS, but we might be on like a 20-second delay. Otherwise, you guys are seeing us right now, live. Hello, everyone. People who are already here, let me know how the sound levels are. I have my mic in a new spot so that you could hear both of us. So type in the chat. Hello to Greg and Chad. Hello, Jarrett. Sergio. Gilgamesh was here earlier. Hi, guys. And Bartermania here for the shrimp as always. All right, AZ said it sounds great. All right, you guys, as people start coming in and finding this coaching stream, welcome. We do this normally for members. We open it up to all channel subscribers today, and we have sort of special presentation mode that Jesse has made for you all today. And it's just sort of a thank you. I know I've been kind of off the radar. We've been busy for the past week. I've been making a brand new channel, and I'll give you guys more details for that. But since we haven't been live streaming online stuff, thought let's get into a coaching session. So I'm going to be quiet now. Well, for most of the rest of this coaching session, say hi to Jesse. And on the side, I'll be reading your chat, asking questions to him, trying to guide the conversation towards the end of his presentation. But feel free to keep asking them. I will be reading them and taking notes, as always, on my little coffee post-it on the side.
If there's a good question like relating to one of these, just
Yeah.
let me know.
Oh, that's a good point. Okay, if you have a question related to, there's going to be slides that we go through. There's going to be some range charts and some pictures or whatever. If you ever have any questions about that stuff immediately, pop it in the chat and we'll, I'll filter it to him and see if he can answer it then. Sound good, everyone? Let me know in the chat right now what you guys play, like what your normal stakes are, how often you guys play, where you're watching from, and I'll let Jesse get into it. So let's take it away.
Just jumping right in.
Yeah. Do you want to explain a little bit about what we're going to be doing today?
Okay, so we were looking through some different presentations, whatever you want to call it, classes that I've done for groups of students in the past. And this was one of probably my favorite and your favorites, I
Yeah.
think. It was about playing flop, and I guess a lot of it's about playing flop versus c-bet because, as you can probably tell in tournaments, everybody c-bets nearly every single time, and so it's really good to have a really solid strategy to fight against that. Um, and just to like kind of create a good framework of how to think about how to play against c-bets and how to think about when you want to check raise and stuff is really important. Because you can kind of adjust from that framework, but if you don't have a really good set framework to start out with, then you're going to have trouble.
So just a quick kind of glance at the chat. A lot of you guys are cash gamers. They play kind of lower stakes, a couple of higher stakes, some 510 in here, MTTs under 1K. And then some of you are already concerned about charts. Trust me, this class is a little bit this will help you if you're not so much into the GTO thing, or you play with a bunch of people like this guy said, I play with a bunch of idiots. If you have a bunch of people at your table who are not quite playing GTO, this is a perfect class because Jess is going to talk about how humans play and how we can exploit that.
Cool. So, all right, so flop play. A lot of this is going to relate to tournaments, but I'm also going to talk about deeper stack play, which will relate to cash games a lot more, or early on in tournaments when you're like 100 blinds deep or 80 blinds deep or whatever. So we will talk about that if we don't immediately. Just know that I'll get into that a little bit. But I want to start out by just talking about basic strategy. So like here's some really simple things to keep in mind. If you do this, especially in tournaments, it's not the perfect GTO strategy, but it's a strategy that's going to just make you a winner in almost every field imaginable. So immediate things that you should add to your game that will make it a lot easier. If you get to the flop, these are all flop things, guys, keep in mind. If you get to the flop and you're in a heads up pot post flop, so like let's say you raise the cutoff and the big blind calls. Anytime you're in position, so you're the pre-flop raiser and they called out of the blinds, you can, on any given board with any given hand, you can bet 30% 30% of the pot size. So let's say there's 5 blinds in the pot, you bet like a blind and a half. On 100% of boards with 100% of your hands, it's never that bad of a strategy. I've gone through a ton of different simulations and kind of
Yeah.
adjusted to see like how much equity I'm losing if I do this instead of like what the solver comes up with, which is a really complicated strategy. And it's always doing well as a strategy. So if you just started c betting every single time you're in a heads up potting position, like you're not going to have anything really bad happen in general. You'll have tricky hands or whatever, but your overall strategy is going to do really well.
Yeah.
Similarly, if you're at a position in a heads up pot, so let's say you open like the hijack and the button calls, there are some boards where betting is pretty good. But for the most part, if you were to check 100% of the time with 100% of your range and then go from there with some check raises and some check calls and some folds, you will also have a very strong strategy that's very hard for your opponents to exploit. In fact, they probably just won't exploit it. And if they do, it'll be for very small amounts of equity. And this will make your lives so much easier because when you're on the turn and you're trying to think about, like, would I have this hand? Is it even possible I have a hand better than the one I have? You always know where your range is at because you've c-bet 100% of the time in position or you've checked 100% of the time. So this just makes your life so much easier on future streets. And it's really easy to remember. Multi-way, checking 100% out of position is almost exclusively great. It's just, you just don't bet that much when you're out of position in multi-way pots. So if you just turned it into not betting at all, it's just a really nice strategy.
Yeah, remember that too. If you guys are in smaller stakes games or smaller MTTs, they are doing less 3-betting and squeezing post or pre-flop, so you're going to be in a lot of multi-way pots. So it's really good to kind of keep these things in mind for multi-way pots, especially.
Yeah.
One thing Andrew asked in the chat, is this going to be uploaded to the channel afterwards? If you can't stay for the entire thing, yes, for at least a week or so, I'll keep it up on the channel. And you guys can watch it in the replay.
Okay, so then from there, the things that you can work on your game as you grow as a poker player is adjustments from this strategy, right? So there are boards where if you start studying poker a lot, you'll realize there are some boards where you want to bet less than 30% of the pot, or there are boards where you want to bet more than 30% of the pot, and sometimes you want to check whatever. If you want to gain a more complex strategy, that takes time and study. But if you have this base strategy, you can kind of take that and then work your way up in terms of complicated strategies from there. So that's just like something to keep in mind. But this strategy will I teach it to people who play fairly high stakes online. They do quite well.
Didn't you tell me one time that Doug Polk used to teach his students to never check raise on certain streets so that they had a really clear strategy?
Yeah, when he taught them heads up, they started out just never check raising flop or turn.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, you're going to make a little bit more money if you have some raises on flop and turn, but realistically, you're not raising that much. And if you start out learning your ranges and they just do one thing, it's so much easier to know where your range is at in different parts of the game tree.
So all of that to say that this is not going to be 100% accurate all of the time, but this is going to make your brain have less decisions in the moment and less stress about am I making the right play? It's like, if you know that you're not too far off, just follow this until you get more into the weeds of solvers, etc.
Okay. All right, so flop play. This is what I really want to get into versus c-bets, because I'm sure almost everyone has noticed that people just continuation bet all the time, nonstop, and they want to be able to play really well versus it. And also, I think this is kind of where the edge that you can have over other people really starts, like how you can exploit and stuff like that. So the easiest shortcut to whether you're raising a hand or calling with a hand. So this is kind of how I think about what hands want to be raising on the flop versus c-bet. So for value, I say, is this a hand that is happy to get it all in? If my opponent, if I check raise this flop and my opponent like re-raises, is this a hand that's happy to get it all in? And if the answer is yes, then it's a good hand to raise for value. If the answer is no, then it's probably a good hand to just check call. So for instance, on a king high board, maybe like you're in a tournament, you're 30 blinds deep or 40 blinds deep, and you're like, yeah, king jack, I'm happy to get in, but king deuce, I'm not. So that's a nice differentiator right there. Maybe you use your king deuces to start calling down with and bluff catch a little bit more, and use your king queens to check raise and get it in. Can I have the?
Oh, sorry. reading comments.
Okay, and then in terms of bluffing, I say, is this a hand that's not good enough to call with? And if so, is it a decent bluffing candidate? So there's a lot of hands that are like 9 high, so they're not very good to call with, but they are. I need to see that. But they are. Maybe they have like a backdoor flush draw and a backdoor straight draw, and they have a lot of cool turn cards that can come out for you after you check raise. So maybe it's a really nice hand to check raise. So yeah, like if you have a hand that's not good enough to check call, in your opinion, like you don't think it'll play favorably on the turn and river, but it is a pretty good hand, it's like one of the worst hands that you're going to check fold, then it's probably a good hand to check raise and put in your bluff range. So your bluff range becomes hands strong enough to get all in, and hands strong enough to get all in, and hands not strong enough to call with, but play pretty well on future streets if they check raise. And that's how I think about building a check raising range. There's not a lot of boards where your check raising range is more than like 15 or 20% of your total hands. So that's something to keep in mind, that they're not these giant, super substantial ranges. They're just, a smaller offshoot of your larger range that's on the flop.
Quickly, before we go into examples, a couple of people are asking about playing against really aggressive opponents in general. Do you want to cover that at the end of class, or do you want to enter it right here?
Yeah, well, can you remind me? We'll talk about
it. Okay, so anything that doesn't have to do directly with these slides, you guys, I'm writing down on this little paper, so don't think that I'm not getting to your questions or not reading them, but I want to get to them maybe towards the end of class. But thank you guys for participating. Okay.
Okay, so one exploit that I really like to keep in mind is against people that c-bet 100% of the time or close to 100% of the time, I like to bluff raise too much if they were a late position player. So like, let's say they open the button or the cutoff and they're c-betting like 100% of the time. I try to bluff raise a lot because they're going to have a lot of hands that miss the board, right? Because they raised a lot of hands pre-flop because they were the button or whatever. And it's hard for them to defend all of those hands. And more often than not, people under defend versus check raise versus like what they should in theory defend. So I like to really attack the button and the cutoff with a lot of check raises personally. Okay, so here's an example.
If you guys are unfamiliar with this software, up at the top, it just is telling you all of the action that led up to post flop. You want to like show them, because I don't know if everybody's seen this kind of layout before.
I kind of put it right here too.
Okay.
Here's an example. So cutoff raises. We're in the big blind. We peel, and the flop is queen 7 deuce rainbow. The cutoff continuation bets like a fifth of the pot. So let's say the pot's like 5 blinds. They bet 1 blind. So what the question is? What are our check raises in theory? Right? Oh, by the way, we're 30 blinds deep in the tournament. So we're not super deep, we're pretty shallow.
And this is based on GTO Wizards.
Yeah, which is really just like a pre-solved site for a bunch of PO solutions. So like they're taken from PO initially.
Yeah.
So the question is like, what do we want to check raise on queen 7 deuce 30 blinds deep versus the cutoff? Right? So think about that for a second. What hands do we want to do it for value with? What hands do we want to do it as a bluff?
And if you guys want to enter it into the chat and see kind of like what the baseline average is, it's nice to think in terms of borderline hands. So what's the worst hand you would check raise here for value with?
Yeah. Exactly.
And then you can do it the opposite. What's the best hand? I guess you could call it the best hand, but what's the best hand you would check raise as a bluff with?
Yeah.
That's kind of a weird way to put it, but you know what I mean. So put in your answers. We'll kind of gauge how the class thinks about this spot. You want to repeat the question one more time?
I think you just kind of did.
Oh, okay.
You kind of nailed it. But and then the other question is, if we want to overbluff, what other hands could we maybe think about throwing in there?
So we've got a couple of.
Yeah. And then I'm gonna ignore the third question for now. But for value, we got one person, David E, saying for value, queens, ace queen, 7-7, jack jack.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting, you don't have king queen, but you do have jack jack.
Queen.
Queen 7 deuces, yep. Ace deuce. Oh, I think that you're saying that as a bluff.
So the question was, what is the worst hand for value that you would check raise here as the big blind versus a cutoff C bet? Remember, they only went 20% of the pot. So your value range can be a little wider when they go smaller. And then on the opposite end, what type of bluffs? For those of you who have been putting into the chat, I have so much trouble bluffing.
Yeah,
think about it. Think about it now. Yeah, we'll give you guys the answers after this, or the answers, quote unquote. But we'll lead you in the right general direction. But just kind of think about what type of bluffs would you like to have? What makes sense to you right now before we kind of give it away in a couple of minutes.
Jerry says can check raise a lot of the queens, suited sevens, some offsuit sevens, some suited king X. Worst hand to check raise is any two with the backdoor flush draw. Okay, so like that's your kind of your bluffs.
Mm-hmm.
Or I guess no, I'm sorry. That's like it's kind of a mergy thing. But yeah.
Nice. Okay. So what do you think?
All right.
You want to tell them what you would do?
Well, we're gonna look at what the solver does first. So we'll talk about that. So here's what the solver comes up with on this board versus this size. It says that
so Sergio, that's a good question. He said, if you have a value hand, why would you raise?
Okay.
The whole thing is that you're trying to get called by. You think that you can get called by worse.
Yeah. So the reason that you check raise a value hand is because there's a few reasons, but the most important reason when you're at a position is you want to control the betting, right? If you just check call with a hand like, let's say you have a really strong hand like pocket sevens. If you just call the flop, then your opponent now has the choice to just check back turn, and you're not gonna be able to get it all in by the river if they do that, right? Because now the pot is like 9 blinds, and you guys have like almost 30 behind, so you're just not going to get it in by the river. You can make a bet on the river. You can try to check raise the river, but they might check back. But they get to control the pot because they're in position if you just call. But as soon as you start check raising with hands, now you're saying I'm taking control of the betting. I'm gonna if I want to get it all in by the river, I can check raise flop, bet turn, bet river. So in theory, you're really interested in taking the hands that want to get it in and can start taking over the betting and doing the betting yourself. And then you're going to mix in bluffs so that they can't just fold a lot versus that, or else, at least your bluffs are making a bunch of money if they do so.
Just if you guys are unfamiliar with this software, the blue hands are hands that we defended pre-flop and now we're folding on this chart. The green means that we're check calling, and the pink and dark red means that we're check raising.
Okay, so what did the solver come up with? This is a little bit complicated, but I'm going to kind of talk about it. So the solver came up with, it likes check raising a lot of queens for value. I think somebody said that in chat. I see. Yeah. So you can see that most of the queens are check raising at least some of the time. And the best kicker queens are always check raising. So king queen's always check raising, queen jack's always check raising. We're only 30 blinds deep, so the solver is very happy with getting those hands in by the river. When you start getting like queen 7, queen 6, you can see that it's queen 5. It's mixing between raising and calling, so it's pretty indifferent. But it likes check raising a lot and getting value now before they can start checking down. Now, if you check raise a hand like Queen Five, maybe you find some checks on bad turn cards, and maybe you don't get it all in by the river, but you're still getting more money in the pot as soon as possible. So now, like, what are our bluffs? Is the question. Oh yeah, and then also we're check raising, our two pair hands a lot. Not Queen Deuce. We're check raising seven Deuce. We're check raising Queen Seven. We're check raising. You can see there's some sevens in there with backdoor flush draws that are check raising. What other bluffs do we have? So we're mixing in some of these ace three, ace four, ace five type of hands with a backdoor flush draw. So anything with like a backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw is a nice one. We've got stuff like 5-6 suited with backdoor flush draw, so that can make a lot of turn. That can find a lot of turn cards where it makes a flush draw or straight draw and keep bluffing, which is nice. And then we're using some ace X offsuit that has like backdoor wheels. So again, like that can turn a straight draw, that can turn top pair. And then it also likes these king X suiteds with the backdoor flush draw for the same reason. You can make top pair on the turn, you can turn a flush draw. So like, what's the common theme of all these bluffs? I think that the common theme in my mind is all of them have good turn cards where they either make really nice hands to continue bluffing with, like a straight draw or flush draw, or they can turn top pair. So if your hand can do something like that, then it's probably a good candidate for a check raise bluff. Also, these are all hands that you're not really thrilled check calling, right? Ace four is, you could check call with it, but it's not like a particularly exciting hand to check call on this flop, right? Not only is it maybe not ahead, but even if it is ahead, your opponent could keep bluffing and you might have to fold the turn or whatever. So the solution that the solver comes up with is we're check raising most of our top pairs or better, and we're mixing in a lot of king high backdoor flush draws, backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draws, and ace high backdoor flush draws or ace highs. Now that's all really nice, right? That gives us kind of a good framework of what types of hands we want to be bluffing and what types of hands we want to be check raising at the stack size. But my other question was, what check raises can we add in if we want to overbluff? So what would I do? I would personally start taking some of these 9-6 suited hands, 5-6 suited hands, the hands with backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draws, and I just do them more often. Maybe I'd always check raise when I have any sort of backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw. Maybe I take some of these king high hands and do it a little bit more. Maybe I take these ace high hands that are mixing sometimes and do it as much as possible. I tend to believe that people won't be calling our check raise with as many hands as they should, so I tend to just really attack these boards. In fact, if you'll notice that there's like some weird funky hands in there. I think somebody in the chat actually mentioned it, but there's like some deuces in there, like ace deuce suited. Maybe I'll use some more deuces to check raise because deuces are hard to defend once you check call the flop. So I might do a little bit more of that.
Chris said, tons of bluffs work here simply for the fact that the board is so disconnected, right? Apologies because I joined late and missed who were the aggressors. So if you guys joined late, just to catch you up, this is cutoff versus big blind. And this is the big blind's point of view after cutoff. That's 20% of the pot. And you're right. I think we chose this example because it is such a disconnected dry flop. But I think that sometimes people just sort of give up a little easier because they're just like, oh, I'm not drawing to anything. And they just kind of check fold.
Yeah.
And it's a perfect opportunity to kind of attack that cutoff c-bet because they're thinking this is a great board to c-bet. So it's this is just a framework. I don't know if we loaded up what cutoff is quote unquote supposed to be calling with against our check raise, but that would be your next step if you're studying because you guys might be surprised what the solver expects them to be calling your check raise with that humans probably are just not doing. They probably are just going to be folding to your check raise. And if that's the case, like think about it. If they're check raising all of these hands expecting to get called so often, you should probably check raise even more, like Jesse said. So all of these hands that are half pink, half green, half call, half raise, just turn it all the way into a raise. And it'll probably work a lot of the time. And that kind of leads us to the third question on this slide.
Which is, how do we adjust our turn range if we are happy with over bluffing on the flop? So I'd love to see an answer in the chat or some answers in the chat to that. But basically, if we're over bluffing, if we're bluffing more than we think we should when we check raise the flop, then how are we adjusting on the turn to kind of
Like if we actually get called because we think our bluffs are going to work, how do you think our turn strategy is going to change when we get called after over bluffing? Anybody got any thoughts? Hello, Aditya. Nice to see you. Crazy in the chat. We'll give you guys a few extra seconds. Post your answers.
So I'm just gonna go for. Oh, we connect on anything? I guess I just meant overall. So regardless of. Yes, Daniel Williams.
Hold on, let other people answer.
Okay.
Pretend the turn is a blank. Pretend it's not something that connects with your backdoors. I love all your personalities. We've got so many different ways to say go all in. Total brick, Randy. Total brick. What are you gonna do once you check raise
So
way too many hands?
I'm gonna say something first of all because there's a lot of very like polar, very black or white type of answers. It's gonna be a nuanced thing. So it's never everything in poker is kind of nuanced. So it's never it's gonna be a small adjustment. It's not gonna be like something massive, right? Because we're never making massive changes to our strategy. We're just trying to adjust our strategy a little bit based on what we're doing. Um, like for instance, I didn't say, "Oh, I'm gonna check raise every combo that I have on the flop," because I would never do that. I would just add a few more combos in, right?
All right. So going back to Daniel Williams, congratulations. That's the answer I'm sure Jesse was looking for.
Yeah. So basically, if we bluff too much on the flop, then the idea is that we think they're not going to call as much as they should on the flop. So if they don't call as much as they should on the flop, then the expectation is that they reach the turn with a stronger set of hands than they should, right? So if that's true, then I'm going to be a little more careful on the turn. I'm going to check a little bit more or give up a little bit more often than maybe I should because I think that the range that reaches the turn is stronger than it should be. So if you're ever attacking a street really hard because you think that they'll fold too much, then you should probably be a little bit more careful in the next street, right?
Yeah. The times that they actually do call, that means you're relying on that read that like if they call my raise here, they're gonna have the goods. So then
Yeah.
you can just happily give up because for the most part you're expecting them to fold too much.
Okay. So let's try another example. So we're 40 blinds deep this time. They open the cutoff. We're in the big blind. We call. And the flop is king, queen, three with two diamonds. They bet like 20% of pot again, we'll say. 1.2 bigs. What hands are we interested in check raising on this board 40 blinds deep? So what are your value? What's like your worst value hand that you check raise? And what are some of your bluffs? Like what types of bluffs do you think are good to be check raising?
Yeah, AJ had it. He said, if I'm check raising a really dry board, I'm getting caught. I'm giving up.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Michael.
Yeah,
That's very
thanks,
sweet.
man.
All right, get your answers in there. 15-second countdown. What are you guys check raising based on what we just saw? What types of bluffs? What types of value? You have 40 big blinds. Nice. Curtis is check raising two pairs, combo draws. Rachel's worst value hand would be King 7 with a backdoor flush draw. So King 7 of clubs in this case. Bluffs would be all straight draws and maybe some weaker queens. PLK says ace 10 off. So if you guys are ever check raising this with value hands, try to make sure you have some bluffs, right? You never want to be so off balance that you only have value hands. it's especially hard on rivers, but on flop it's not as hard to have bluffs.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So what do you think about what people have to say?
So I didn't pull up a solution for this one because I wanted to kind of give you my off the cuff thoughts on this. And if I look at a solution later, maybe I get a few wrong. That happens. That's we're all human. But but my first thought was because we're 40 blinds deep instead of 30, I think we need to be a little bit more careful about what top pairs we're check raising because not all of them are just as happy to get in the 40 blinds as 30 blinds, right? So Rachel said she'd cut it off at king 7. I think it's good to think in that sort of way. Like the deeper you get, the more you have to be like, my cutoff on kicker is here. So yeah, I might even start a little higher. Maybe I check raise all like my king 9s or all my king 8s or something like that. But I think that type of thinking is really nice. So let's say maybe I check raise. And I know the solver is going to mix in like a little bit of king 6 and it'll just be like less of each one as your kicker goes down. But I don't really like doing that personally. I like just using the better kickers and check calling the worse ones. I think that's a more like non-robotic human way to do it. Uh, I would check raise something like king 9, king 10 plus a lot. I check raise a lot of my two pairs, probably all my two pairs. Maybe a little check call king 3, but I would, and then I would check raise a bunch of flush draws. I think our flush draws are going to get to check raise a lot on this type of board. Maybe some hands with a backdoor flush draw. So like the one that first comes to my mind is something like ace 4 with the ace of diamonds. I think that's a really good one because when the flush gets there, I don't want to just have a bunch of flushes. I want to have some bluffs as well. And my best bluffs are going to be like the ace of diamonds type of hands, right? So I'm going to check raise some of those. And if they have a backdoor straight draw to go with them, so if they're like, ace 4, ace 5, or ace deuce, that's all the better.
AJ,
Um,
that's a cool point. You want to say something?
Use that. Pretty big range disadvantage board. My bluffs are going to have a lot of equity. Yeah, so so like the range I built so far is pretty high equity range, right? We have a lot of strong hands, a lot of value hands, and then we have like our bluffs are flush draws, so those are pretty strong hands as well as far as bluffs go. Yeah, and then because of what you're saying, and I think that's really important that it's a better board for them than us. Um, we're also going to not use that many pure bluffs, right? We'll use a lot of flush draws. So basically, our whole range is going to be stronger because our bluffs are stronger and our value hands are a little stronger, and also we're deeper, so we're a little stronger. So that's how I would kind of construct it. And then I might throw in a few kind of like non-standard hands, like maybe my very worst threes. So like 3-4, 3 deuce suited or something like that. I might check raise because um, we can make two pair, which is still a very strong hand at the stack depth, or we can make trips, and we're just very happy getting it in. And we also like kind of block them having one of their sets or best types of hand sets or two pairs. And we do have immediate outs at like kind of the nuts, which is kind of nice. So hands like that are kind of cool to use. I use 3-4 and 3 deuce because they're just my worst threes, so I'm just going to turn them into bluffs. And I just think they play really poorly if you check call. Like you're just never gonna know what you're doing on turns and rivers if your opponent bets again. It's very hard to make those profitable as check calls.
All right, Alistair has a question. What sizing are we using when we check raise these boards? And what we're going to reference is check raising against this 20% sizing that Cutoff used.
So that's a really good question, and I would start by saying that the deeper stacked you are, the bigger you want your raise size to be in general. So like when you play cash games, your raise size should be your check raise size should be a lot bigger than when you play tournaments, and you're shallow stacked. At 40 blinds deep, I might go somewhere around the pot. So if they make it like, not a pot size raise, but if they make it like 1.2, maybe I make it like 6 big blinds or something like that. You want to think about your check raises in terms like relative, like what a pot size raise would be. So like in this situation, a pot size raise would be I think 7.9 because you're calling the 1.2 and then you're putting in another 5.5 or whatever. Anyways, I would probably just raise to something like 5 or 6 blinds in this. And if we were shorter, like let's say we were like 20 blinds deep and I'm check raising, I'd make it like 4.5 blinds or 4 blinds. And if we were deeper, like 100 blinds deep, I might make it like 7 or 8 blinds.
Yeah, it's
So,
always relative to your stack size and the pot size all at once. So,
mhm.
all right, Deborah has a good question. If we're 40 big blinds deep and we check raise, why? Um, and why is that? I don't know how this is phrased, but basically, if you check raise a king X or flush draws and you get jammed on, she wants to know what you do.
So that's kind of where like I can tell you what like a solver might do. I think the solvers mostly call with their top pairs that they've check raised, and then they fold like a lot of their worst flush draws, and they call a lot of their best flush draws. So you are folding some of your like value hands a little bit, but I think that's. I don't think in theory you see a lot of jams, and in game you might actually see some jams. So like what I like to do is I like these spots because I feel like they make me make real time decisions that I think I can. I like those spots because I try to make better decisions than my opponents. So like let's say my opponent has been somewhat tight versus check raises or somewhat in line versus check raises. This is the kind of spot where I might actually like check raise something like king nine. If they just pile it in, I might fold.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with that because they're putting in a lot of blinds and I don't think they're bluffing that much. Yeah, occasionally I'll get bluffed by like ace 10 of diamonds, but that's not really the end of the world because they either have a better hand than me or they have a really good draw, and I'm not doing very well versus that range of hands.
First of all, hi Jamin, and second of all, Arch has another question. How do these ranges change if cutoff bets half or pot? Which is a great question because we're not going to go too in depth in this class, but I think it's a good thing to address right here as we're talking about all of these light raises.
Yeah, so just like you go bigger with deeper stack size or whatever, it's all like a sliding scale, right? The bigger their c bet is, the less hands you want to be check raising because the bigger their c bet is, in theory, the stronger their range should be, and so um, in theory, the stronger your response should be, right? So you have to like check raise less top pairs. You only want to check raise stronger top pairs. You want to check raise less bluffs because of that, because you have less value hands, and so on and so forth. So like your response to bigger c bet should be to check raise less often and have it be stronger. And if you do that, it's going to be really hard for them to exploit you. In fact, they just can't really exploit you because you're adjusting to something theoretically. But yeah, the bigger they go, the less. Think about it like this: the bigger they bet ever, the better odds they're giving you to just wake up with a hand. Like if the pot was $2 and your opponent just went all in on the flop for $100, you wouldn't need to call that much, right? Because they're just laying you so much money to just find a set or two pair like the nuts. So you just fold everything else. You're like, cool, I'll just wait till I have the nuts because you're putting $100 in a $2 pot. So it's like that's an extreme example, but you could scale that backwards and think about how much you want to respond versus each different size. So the bigger they bet, the less often you're check raising, and the stronger your check raising range is.
That's good.
Thanks.
Okay, Randy has a great question. I know a lot of you guys have this question in mind or have had it in the past, so I think it's worth addressing. He said, I struggle with the words solution or solver because those apps assume that the hand is played perfectly, and we know that nobody plays perfectly. So how much faith can we put in those scenarios? So what we're covering with this class is we're using these solvers as a tool to understand what that's why we keep saying quote unquote should be happening, and then we look at that as our jumping off point so we can be adjusting so to humans, like you said. So what Jesse was showing you guys with the chart with all the hand ranges of like what we should be check raising against an opponent or what they should be c betting, when you look at what they should be calling you with and you realize, wow, my opponent is folding a lot. That's why he changed. He was asking you what hands would you add to that bluffing range? Because you're expecting humans to not play perfectly, like you say. They're just really a tool, but you can't, it's not a memorization thing. I think you're right in the fact that people misuse them. They just basically memorize and then try to execute that exact strategy, which is not going to help you in the real world against people.
So the way that I use solvers is basically what you just said, but like I just use it as a baseline to see like if this is the range, then you should do this, and then I use my own brain to think about, well, what do people actually do compared to this, and then I think about, okay, if they change from what the standard is in this way, how do I want to respond with my play? So like if people don't bluff enough, then I'm not going to call as often as the solver, right? I'm going to fold more because I don't think they're bluffing enough. Like it's just a really nice baseline to like to start with, and then you make the adjustments how you feel fit. But if you don't have that baseline, then you don't know where to start.
Uh, Once again, for those of you guys asking questions in chat, if they have direct correlation with the class, I'll ask him right away. If not, I'm saving them for the end. So Moose Null, don't worry. I see your button straddle question. We'll get to it more towards the end.
Yeah. Oh, Rachel said, how would you play a weak flush draw versus pot size bet? This is a really specific example, but it kind of illustrates what I'm trying to say. Like, so if my opponent has been c betting in normal size, and then all of a sudden they just bet pot on a board, and I have a weak flush draw, I'm probably just gonna call with that hand. I won't check raise it ever. I might just like see one more street, and then if they bet really big again, fold. There's some players I've occasionally just folded, but that's pretty rare because I'm not really trying to fold flush draws on the flop. Um, but if it's a player who just is absurd and just seems to c bet pot every single time, and they c bet a lot, then now I'm assuming that they still have all of the hands that they raise with preflop, which is a lot of hands, right? And they have a lot of air. So I might go back to check raising a hand like that again, because I think that I have a lot of fold equity. So like, let's say that I'm 30 blinds deep and the pot's 5 blinds, and they bet 5 blinds, and they've been doing that every time. I might just rip it in because I have a decent semi bluff. Um, but if you just check called every time, that'd probably be perfectly fine as a strategy. Um, you're also going to check call some of your top pairs and stuff. So if they keep betting the turn, you have stuff to defend with, anyways. You could even slow play some stuff if you want, if they just are relentless and keep betting.
For all the cash
Okay.
gamers in the chat.
Yeah. So we kind of said this before, but as you get deeper stacked, what is what the type of hand that you're willing to get in with gets stronger and stronger, right? We're no longer check raising king 6 on a king high board and getting it in. If we're 100 blinds deep, that would be suicidal. So yeah, so all of a sudden now we're only happy check raising maybe like 2 pairs on the flop and getting it in, or sets. Maybe like top pair, top kicker occasionally, or like maybe something like if you for some reason slow played like aces and it was a queen high board, maybe you're happy to get in with aces because you can get in versus like king queen or whatever. Um, so yeah, we our value hands get thinner and thinner and stronger, or I should say our value range gets thinner because our value hands get stronger. And what happens to our bluff range? Our bluff range has to get smaller as well, right? Because um, we can't if we're bluffing, at a certain ratio, and all of a sudden our value hands are way less in numbers, then we have to have less bluffs as well, right? We want the same ratio. One cool thing about deeper stacked is that your opponents not only are calling because they think they have the best hand, but they have to play feature street. So you do get to have the deeper stacked you get to have a little higher of a bluff to value ratio. But generally, you're going to have less bluffs than when you're shallower stacked, and you're going to have less value hands. So that's kind of how you think about it. And you want your value hands to be quite strong. Now, can you occasionally, against like somebody who hates folding, check raise top pair and then figure it out on turns and rivers as an exploit? Absolutely. If I have some guy who's just like betting every flop and they hate folding, I'm gonna check raise like queen jack on a queen high board and then maybe bet turn, then figure it out on river if they do something. But like, those are adjustments that you guys got to make. You're smart people and you want to go out there and play poker based on what you perceive people to do at the table. A lot of poker is figuring out the baseline and then making your own decisions in game. That's like the best players in the world aren't. I mean, they're all somewhat similar in their grasp of theory, and I think really it's just their execution and how they respond to other players that differentiates them from the others. All right, so let's talk about when somebody c bets and we're in position. So let's change our position from the big blind to the button. And we're playing against the cutoff. So the cutoff is open. We peeled the button. Everyone else folded. And they still c bet. How do our ranges change? How do we play our hands? Any guesses?
Don't think about specific hands or specific boards. Just think about like your overall strategy. If you are in position versus the C better, what is your overall strategy against that bet? Do you fold more? Do you call more? Do you raise more?
Greg, you said much wider, but what do you do much wider? You just mean continue much wider?
Nice. Seems like we're getting there. Okay, we've got a lot of all over the place answers. You want to?
Okay, so we are doing way more calling and way less raising. So people who said wider, I think they just meant play more hands, which is definitely true. We're continuing with more of our range. Keep in mind too that the button range is already a lot thinner than a big blind range, right? We're calling like 70 or 85% of hands in the big blind. We're calling like 20% or 18% of hands from the button. So you're already a lot, you already have a much stronger range. But we're also going to be continuing with a lot of that range more often. We're also going to be raising a lot less. Why is that? Because we're already in position. So our value hands have less incentive to take control of the betting because if they want to check the turn, they don't just get to check back and see the river, right? Like when our opponents see bet and we call and now they check the turn, we still get to decide if money goes in on the turn. That's a really crucial factor in poker. Position just matters so much in poker. And so for that reason, we get to control the size of the pot when we have some of these weaker top pairs, or we get to control the size of the pot when we have certain hands. And because we're just calling, we get to incorporate more floats and stuff like that. So I think a lot of you guys said some really good stuff in there. All right, so here's our example from before. Same board, same situation, except that now we're the button, and the cutoff has C bet on Queen 7 Deuce Rainbow. So obviously we have less hands to start out with, right? We're missing all of these lower suited hands. We're missing a lot of the off-suited hands that would appeal from the big blind. But look what happens here. The blue is fold. So all of a sudden we're going from. Also, they've C-bet bigger than before. They were betting 20% before. Now they're betting 33. But that's
Yeah.
You hear it there. We are barely ever folding if you look at this chart. What we are doing is we're almost always continuing by calling. In fact, there's only one hand on this whole chart that always raises. Every single other hand does some amount of calling. Actually, I guess technically there's two hands. Yeah, there's two types of hands. Kings and ace queen always raise. Ace queen offsuit. Everything else at least calls some of the time, which means that calling is perfectly fine. Because anytime the solver does two different things, that means it thinks that the value of the two things is the same. So what does that mean for us? That means that if we were to just, maybe we fold our Jack 10 offsuit on this board, or Jack 8 offsuit, and our Ace 9 offsuits, and then if we were to just peel everything else and never raise and never fold anything else, I think that would be a very reasonable strategy.
Yeah, remember this is remember this is also a very dry board. So just take that with a grain of salt, but yes. Mm-hmm.
So
just comparing, it's kind of cool to compare. Right, hold on. It's kind of cool to compare. This is our, just for reference, if you guys weren't here earlier, this is what we're doing in position, and this is what we were doing from the big blinds. We have like a ton of folding going on. So I just wanted to show you guys that.
And a lot of that's because you just have such a strong range in the button. But yeah. So to show like a more draw heavy board, we could say, to see if there's like more raising going on. I put in the same situation, but I changed the queen to an 8 of diamonds. So now we have this 8-7 deuce 2 diamond board, which is a lot more draws. It means we, like, in theory, want a little bit more protection now. Um, and we're a little bit more worried about them having certain things that have a lot of equity versus our made hands. Uh, we're still, yeah. Well,
Okay.
we are still almost never raising, right? All of these hands in here, except for maybe you could make the argument that queens should raise almost always, and nines. Like, nothing is particularly thrilled about raising. Queens, jacks, and nines are the only ones that are close to always raising, and everything else is like very happy calling. So that's kind of going to show that you don't need to play a raise strategy on this board for your strategy to be really profitable. Queen Bee Poker said, "Would you raise more with value hands at all, being in position or being in position better to just call and let them possibly bluff more?" Yeah, so there are certainly some value hands that like raising a bit more, as we're seeing from a couple of these simulations. But there's not that many, and they all share one very important property. Can you guys guess what it is?
So based on these two ranges that you guys saw, the queen seven deuce and the 8-7 deuce, the hands that actually raise, what are the things that they have in common?
Show you the other one.
Mm-hmm.
These are the hands that raise on Queen 7 Deuce.
We are
King, snakes,
button
queen.
versus cutoff.
And these are the hands that raise on 8-7 Deuce.
Alistair said, it surprises me we're not raising our sets.
I'm going to get to that in one.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll answer that.
That's usually what surprises most people.
If I answer that, it's going to kind of give away what I'm asking.
You're welcome, Peter. Thanks for joining.
Yes, AJ's right. If you raise your sets, your ranges are all unbalanced.
Curtis said they're vulnerable to overcards.
Yes, that is right. Basically, the types of hands that we're interested in raising. Now, again, keep in mind this isn't cash. If we were playing cash, we might raise some sets, or we might raise some. If we're like 100 blinds deep, we'll start raising really strong hands sometimes. But we're 40 blinds deep, and the types of hands that we're interested in raising in position are hands that can, if we want to get it all in, we're happy to do so. So an overpair on 8-7 deuce, what is this, 30 or 40 blinds? 30 blinds deep. We're just getting it in. It's fine. If they have the cooler, they have the cooler. But nines are a very strong hand at this point. Button versus cutoff on 8-7 deuce. So there's two things that go on with the hands that we're raising. One, they're good enough to get in, and two, they are vulnerable, which is kind of what Curtis said. Nines are very vulnerable on 8-7 deuce. There's a lot of bad cards on the turn, like a queen. If a queen comes on the turn, we're no longer very happy getting it in with our nines. In fact, if they start piling it in, we're not even super thrilled calling down, right? We're essentially bluff catching. So these are the hands that would really love getting it in now before bad cards come off. It's sort of similar on the Queen 7 deuce. Kings is an overpair, but it's a vulnerable overpair. You notice that aces never raise really, but kings raise. That's because an ace is a pretty bad card to see on the turn. Whereas when you have aces, a king's not that bad of a card to see on the turn. In fact, if they have like king jack and they hit a king, you're thrilled because now you're going to stack them. So yeah, you want to be raising mostly hands that are vulnerable, but happy to get it in now. The reason why we're not seeing sets is kind of what AJ said. It's going to unbalance your ranges, but also if you're going to build a range that's almost always calling, it's really nice to have some strong hands in there because, and I guess that is what AJ said. Like you're happy to have hands that when they just bluff it off, like it's your auto call. Like you're gonna have some tricky hands where you're not sure what to do when they bluff it off, and you have to make some tough calls or some tough folds. And then you're gonna have some really easy hands like sets that you just get to call down with.
Curtis, that is a great thing to point out. He said queens would always 3-bet pre for what it's worth, nines too. So when you guys look at this chart and you notice that there's some black, some of the hands are all black. Those are the hands you fold pre. And all of your stronger hands, like in this example, pocket tens, pocket nines are half black and half, a different color. That black is representative of the times that you would have 3-betted pre. So this just means that nines you would call half the time and you would have 3-bet half the time pre-flop. When it's black, that means those are the combos that don't exist because you didn't get to this point.
Yeah, so the solver plays a strategy that finds the flop with some amount of kings and queens and jacks and tens, and if you're always re-raising those pre-flop on 30 blinds, that's very fair. Probably how I play poker too. So yeah, maybe you don't have tens or jacks here. Maybe you have a little bit more kings. Maybe you always peel aces. Maybe you don't. I don't know how you play. Um, but for instance, I might call nines on 30 blinds in these positions, or I might call tens occasionally. And if I do, then I'm going to have those in there. And if I don't, it's not the end of the world either because this I'm not playing that many raises anyway. So if I don't have nines or tens in there, it's just not the end of the world, right? I do think if you're not slow playing aces 20 to 30 blinds deep, well, let's say like 10 to 30 blinds deep versus a raise, you should probably think about doing it sometimes because it is a very good strategy because people see bet a lot and they barrel it off, and you'll have a really nice hand to just call down and bluff catch.
Especially if you guys that follow this channel, if you guys ever play on Global or you play on WSOP.com, I know a lot of regs that just kind of snap fold when people 3-bet off of a size of a stack, like an 18 big blind stack size or a 20 big blind stack size, because it's just not intuitive for people to be 3-bet bluffing on that stack size. They'd rather just call a sort of medium-ish hand. So trapping with aces is very nice. They never put you on a strong hand.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really important. Anytime you play differently than how most of the field plays, you're probably going to profit off of what they're doing because people expect you to do one thing and you're doing the other because everyone else is doing that thing. Okay, so this chart just shows us how we play in position on every possible flop texture. If you look at the lower one, this is from deuce high boards, which is basically...
They can't see your mouth, so you're just...
If you look at the lower chart, this is everything from deuce, deuce, deuce boards all the way to like ace, ace, ace boards. And if you notice the lower part of the bottom chart, there's almost no raising across the whole board. You're mostly just calling everything. There's a little bit of folding. You can see the blue in there, and then you can see like the orange or the whatever. What is that color?
Pink.
Pink at the bottom.
Yeah.
Maroon.
Yeah.
Not maroon. Whatever. Maybe it's maroon.
It's kind of like this color.
Yeah. So, all of that is just to say that there are very few boards when you're in position, in these positions, where you really need to play many raises at all. So what does that lead us to? That leads us to an overall strategy that is, or baseline strategy, that is only call with our entire continuing range. So we start out with our baseline strategy of when they see bet, we're just going to either play calls or folds. And then from there, you can add some raises in based on what you think, what types of hands you think you want to be raising with. The ones that are most obvious are the ones that are vulnerable but are happy to get it in. So like what we saw before, like nines on the 8-7x board. Maybe your opponent is really sticky and hates folding, so you want to raise some other types of hands. Like you want to raise some top pairs, you want to raise a set sometimes. Like that's your prerogative and that's your adjustment, and that sounds great. But if you start with the baseline of I'm always going to call, I will fold some of my very worst hands, I'm calling with everything else, and you go from there, that's going to be a really easy way to approach poker, right?
Yeah.
That's a much more like defined strategy than a lot of us generally have on the flop.
Randy, I was talking about global poker, not WPT global. Sorry for the mix-up. And somebody was asking about if nobody pays attention in small stakes tournaments, is it as important to stay balanced? When we were talking about the aces just calling.
If nobody what?
If nobody pays attention in low stakes. We've all been there.
I don't think it's not so important to stay balanced. But what is important is these strategies are mostly based on the fact that like we play a hand this way because it's the most profitable way to play the hand unless they do something really out of line. So the solvers are still prioritizing what they think the most profitable play with is with any given hand. And then if they think that the two things are very similar, like let's say raise and call are extremely similar in profitability, then they'll start mixing in one or the other. So it's not we don't do these things so much because it keeps us completely balanced, because yeah, balance is good, but it's not everything. But we do it because we think that as our baseline strategy, these are the most profitable ways to play these hands. So again, if you think it's more profitable against your opponent to check raise a set, by all means go for it.
That's why it's really good to have notes if you guys play online or to be paying attention at the table, because if you can get really accurate with how your opponents are playing against you and you realize this guy doesn't notice that I'm on 20 big blinds ever. Like he's not paying attention to those types of details. If that's the question you're asking, they're not paying attention to those types of things. Then and they're always calling against three bets, then just three bet.
Uh, Queen B, yeah, we were just talking about specifically calling on the button versus cutoff with aces on like 20 or 30 bigs. If you're,
That was pre-flop.
yeah, if you're early position, still playing still kind of cool, but you're allowing a lot of people to come in behind, so three betting becomes a little more exciting as an option. And if you're deeper stacked, then you want to be three betting aces because you want to give them the chance to four bet and get it in. When you're 30 blinds deep, like I mean, you could call pre-flop, and then even if they check the flop, we're gonna get it in by the river, right? We just go bet jam on river. So it's like there's not a lot we're losing by just calling with aces. Yeah, we're allowing them to catch up with some hands that may have folded to a three bet occasionally, but we're also going to allow them to make top pair and get stacked with hands that would have folded to a three bet. So as soon as you reach a stack size where if they play pot control, we can't get in by the river, then it becomes a little bit better to three bet aces. That's kind of how I would look at it.
Wow, AJ, that is a lot of notes.
That is a lot of notes.
Thanks, Jamil. Hats off to Jesse for this format. Jamil is loving it.
Thanks.
So what do we do versus people who c-bet too much out of position? Okay. You guys know the type. So what we talked about earlier, just to recap for those of you guys who just got here, when you're out of position, heads up, a lot of times you are going to be checking rather than c-betting. What about people who c-bet too much out of position? They don't know that rule, and they're c-betting a lot.
Yeah. So I used, for this one, this is kind of small. I hope everyone can see it all right. For this one, let me know if this is too small, this image for you guys. I used an ace-high board as an example. So this is, we peeled button versus I did it versus an under the gun one range. All right, so fairly strong range opens under the gun one, and we peel the button, and it's ace-8 deuce. And something that not everyone recognizes in poker is that when the button calls against your raise, you have to be very careful on the ace-high boards because the button's range contains a lot of ace-x. It's got ace-jack offsuit, ace-10 offsuit, ace-queen offsuit, and then it's also got like all the suited aces in there in some capacity. However, people do bet these boards way too much all the time. So how do we respond to it? So if you look at this board, well, first of all, we're not folding very much, right? We're folding 22% of the time, and that's against a guy who's only c-betting half the time. So if they're c-betting all the time, then we're going to be folding even less, and we're going to be floating even more because they're just going to have that much more trouble defending enough of their range on the turn after we floated. They're either going to have to try to bluff way too much, which will make our calls profitable, or they're going to have to check fold way too much, which makes our floats profitable because our floats will just bet the turn and win. Another thing I might do is I might start raising a little bit more, right? Maybe some of my very worst hands that aren't as thrilled to float. So something like, what's a hand that's like kind of finding a lot of folds? Like King 7 suited with a backdoor flush draw is just folding against them, betting half the time. If they're betting 100% of the time, maybe I start raising that hand on the flop and just, making their life really tough when they just have some pocket pair or whatever.
Jason, this is a board for no limit MTTs, just so you guys are all on the same page. And I believe we are 30 big blinds deep. Hope that helps.
Yeah, so now I moved the opener over to the hijack because that's a wider position, so they're gonna have a wider range of hands, and we peeled the button again. And look, now we're also like,
wow.
Yeah, they're supposed to check like most of the time, and we're still like almost never folding, and we're still raising a bit. So if they're betting 100% of the time, I'm barely ever folding, if ever. I'm just gonna be floating a lot, and I'm gonna start raising even more. Like I'm gonna raise my ace queens for value. I'm gonna raise maybe like my occasionally bottom set for value. Although like you really don't even need to because you have so much. Like,
man, I was definitely folding way too much. I mean, 7-6 suited, I would never think to just like call against a c-bet, but it's so true. Like a hijack is gonna look at ace-8 deuce rainbow and be like, oh, that's me because I raised pre-flop.
Yeah.
and just c-bet.
Yeah.
And so like if against somebody who's checking the right amount, aka the solver, I'm supposed to call 7-6, then I definitely need to call 7-6 against a human.
Yeah. Also, keep in mind 7-6. Like, there's a chunk of blue in there.
Yeah.
That's the one without the backdoor flush.
Right.
Folding.
So 7-6 of clubs would fold.
Yeah, but if they're betting 100% of the time, you could probably get away with
just float and stab when they check.
Pretty much.
Okay.
So yeah, we're just going to be calling even more, and we're going to be raising a little bit more as well. I don't have like a no locked simulation in here for how we would respond to it, but I just think that you really attack these boards. And this is an extreme example because the ace-high boards are ones that they really have to respect versus the button, and a lot of people don't. But I thought that was a good example because, man, every time I play live poker, I just watch people c-bet infinite on these ace-high boards, and I'm just like, how do they think they're going to get away with this? But like, I think most people just don't defend enough versus the c-bets, so they do kind of get away with it.
I'm definitely not defending enough. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Based on this, but it's so true because then they'll probably double barrel again with like a decent ace, and then check everything that they're not really happy with.
Yeah.
So definitely. Your floats probably make a lot of money.
I don't want to get into the.
Yeah, let's just pass the multi-way. We're getting to the end here, you guys. So the questions that I've written down, I will breeze through with Jesse. If you have any off-topic questions, throw them in the chat, and I'll write them down as Jesse kind of summarizes and recaps everything we talked about.
Yeah. So to summarize, we are c-betting in a heads-up pot. We're c-betting in position 100% of the time. Sorry, before the pre-flop raiser. We're like the original raiser. We're c-betting 100% of the time for 30% of pot in position. We're checking 100% of the time out of position. And then as you study or as you adjust your opponent, you can, adjust from there. And our c-bets versus check raises are dependent on what can go for value for stacks. And then we mix in a bunch of bluffs based on that. And our c-bets when in position, or versus c-bets when in position, we will be calling with 100% of our range. And then we will adjust to our opponents from there.
Right.
And that's how we play really solid winning poker. That's the baseline strategy. And then as you get better and better at poker, you can add nuance from there, but that will get you 90% of the way.
Okay, let's fire off some questions from earlier, and Jesse can kind of watch the chat for new ones. Earlier, we had somebody ask, I open raise...
Wait, sorry, before you ask that, can I just answer Queen B?
Oh, yeah, sorry, Queen B.
I just saw it and it related to. So yeah, Queen B in checking. So if out of position is supposed to be only betting 35% of hands, yeah, they're supposed to be mixing in their checks. They're supposed to be mixing in value hands, strong value hands. Like you should probably have some sets in there that find check raises or whatever. But yeah, they should certainly have. They should have air, medium hands, and very strong hands in both their betting and checking ranges. And obviously, like that's easier said than done. And that's why I think that checking 100% on position just makes your life a lot easier because the solver is going to take all these hands and play them like 33% of the time I bet, 66% of the time I check. And that's really hard in real life. So I like to just check out of position a lot. And then I know I have strong hands in my checking range because I'm checking everything.
Awesome. Thank you guys for showing up. We'll go through these questions. I'm glad you guys enjoyed. Let's fire off some of these very quickly. Rapid fire answers. Somebody wanted to know, I'm opening 3x in cash gains. Is that too big or should I go smaller? This is in a live setting.
I go 2.5x usually in live poker. If you want to go 3, I don't think it's the end of the world. Just know that in theory, you're supposed to raise a few less hands. You have to be slightly tighter if you're going 3 than 2.5 because you're risking a little bit more to win. What's in the middle?
All right, sticking with pre-flop, over-limping in low stakes. Let's say 5 people are in the 5 people have limped in. Somebody said, I think my toxic trait is that I overcall just hoping to hit something. Is this bad?
It depends on what you're trying to hit. If you're trying to hit the nuts and you're getting a good price, so even if you have like a gut shot, but it's a gut shot to the nuts, I think it's worthwhile as long as your opponent's not betting like a pot. But if you're trying to hit a hand that could be beat anyways, that's a very bad trait, and I would start removing that from your life, especially multi-way, because you're just the more players in the pot, the more the better, and the callers are expected to have very strong hands. So if you're drawing to a medium hand, that's probably not where you want to be.
Button straddles. Do they kill the game or are they okay?
I don't. I hate button straddles.
Me too. They
I think
kill the game.
yeah, like because what happens is now like the everyone's raising into the person in position, so they have to have an even stronger hand, so everyone plays tighter. So there's like this extra dead money in the pot that's nice, but you're raising into the straddle that's in position, so it just makes sure like when you do a regular straddle, it just juices up the pot,
Yeah.
right? Because you're adding another blind. But
Yeah.
when you add a button straddle,
You're making the button way too powerful.
yeah, well, I mean, the button's gonna lose money because now they're just putting in dead money, but like they're gonna lose less than if they put in a
Yeah.
regular straddle, and it's everyone else is gonna have to play tighter, and so it just makes the game nittier. I
Yeah.
also hate the rock. I think the rock is really stupid. They use it a lot in PLO. They put it at the Aria, and it's like I just think a regular straddle is better, but I think people just put it in because uh, people wouldn't play if it was just like a regular straddle, but because it's like the rock, it's like different, so they use it or whatever. And any straddle is better than no straddle in terms of like kicking up the stakes. But I just think that in position straddles make the game really nitty and not so good.
Okay. Playing against very aggressive players. Quick thoughts about that.
Okay, so if by really aggressive you mean they just barrel a lot and they just get after it a ton. Um,
Yeah, they don't slow down.
uh, yeah, so what I would do is, I mean, obviously you call down more, but I would also start instead of check raising like all of your nuts, I would start check calling a lot of your nutted hands, and I would I would want to have as many strong hands in my calling range as possible so I can just allow them to keep barreling off.
Nice.
Basically, like start calling some sets so you have more hands that can call down or call down all the way. Start calling more top pairs or whatever. Like that's your adjustment to them basically. And then also like with some of your weaker hands, maybe even call down with those if they're just barreling off all the time.
Jamil said, "My buddy min raises and min bets all the time. Is this a good strategy?"
If the pot's small, it's fine. Once the pot gets really big, you want to be betting relative to the size of the pot. So if you're on the turn, you're min betting into 50 blinds. Like it's not a very efficient bet. It's not going to make anyone fold, and it's not going to get value when you have strong hands. So it's not doing a lot of things you want to be doing in poker.
Yeah. Let's see. Other things are okay. Quick habits for a long MTT series. If you guys are playing, I know that Queen Bee just put something in there about playing Hard Rock. We're on the fence about that series, but if we do go there, we'll see you there. But if you guys are coming out for the World Series, for example, what are some of the habits or daily routines you should get into? I think it's different for everyone, but a basic helpful tip is bring energizing food that is not going to make you very full and lethargic, especially towards the end of the day and for dinner breaks. A lot of people come back from dinner break and it's when the blinds are biggest for the whole day and they are the most tired / tipsy. So that's going to be a pretty bad overall strategy for making a lot of chips in tournaments. When the blinds get bigger, you play worse. So you want to do the opposite.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Really, yeah. I think it's a lot about food and activity. Like if you can, I know it sounds kind of boring because you're in Vegas and you want to like go all out, but maybe do that at the beginning, take a break, and then get ready for the World Series like you would a marathon.
For me, just don't eat like a ton of heavy carbs because you just get bogged down and you get tired, and then you don't realize you're tired until you make like a bad play. You're like, wait, why did I just do that?
Yeah.
It's too late.
Yeah.
Also, getting enough sleep, but that's like a really obvious one. Like sleep and food is monitoring your food intake and sleep is like super important to like thinking clearly, I guess.
Ooh, AJ, thoughts on the double buy-ins in the RNAs on WSOP, the rebuy and add-ons? I've assumed it's just obvious to take 2 starting stacks, but recently saw a couple people I respect. Yeah, you should just single buy. I mean, obviously, the Satellite King himself, Dara O'Kearney, has a book about this, but he did throw something in there about rebuy and add-ons, and they found that like the best strategy is obviously to max late reg and then buy the add-on. And another quick tip about that, even if you have a super monster stack, you should always, according to him, click the add-on button because it's not so much that you're gaining equity when you when you hit that in the field, but when you don't do it, you're losing a tiny bit. So it's like by not doing it, you're losing a tiny bit versus the field. So I know it's kind of weird.
Chad, you're good to go with 5 hours every 60, but you're a superhuman who cannot sleep.
Sergio, what is a typical study session for your daily, weekly practice? We study twice a week in sort of like a group setting for probably an hour and a half to 2 hours each time. And then Jesse studies way more than me. He's always in there with the solvers. So the things that he's kind of intuitively saying to you guys, I think it's based on a lot of that off the table work that he just kind of knows how solvers think, really.
Yeah, and then also like reviewing your own sessions is really powerful. Like going through a tournament that you played and just like seeing what you did. Like sometimes we play hands in ways that because we have a bunch of tables going or we're tired or whatever, and we look back at it like the next day and we're like, wait, what was this? It's like pretty crazy. So going through your session and seeing like you learn a lot of stuff about yourself. Like I realized one day, like, man, like my fourth or fifth hour into playing online, like my play like drops off a lot. And then I was more conscientious to make sure that I was sharp during those hours.
All right, you guys. Jay Ledge, that's a great point to end on. He said, "Thanks for doing this. As this was mostly MTT strategy, can you do something similar for cash games?" I'm
Sure.
I'm putting this up here too because I got a couple of messages on the side for private coaching with Jesse. If you guys want to message him and do some one-on-one sessions, I put his email there that he would be happy to get back to you. I am personally transitioning to a little more cash game study myself to get better at that type of stuff before the WSOP so that if I bust a tournament, sadly, I can jump over to the cash tables and feel more confident. So, yes, to answer your question, yes, we'll do this again and we'll do a cash game series as long as Jesse agrees.
Yeah, that sounds great.
All
I
right.
like cash.
We can do Texas style too, just for you, Chad. Texas and Florida style. How to adjust to the Cowboys. All right, you guys. I think that's good. Any last thoughts?
Somebody said something earlier that I thought was cool, but or a question or something, but not even sure.
Thanks, Phoenix.
Thank you guys for the love. That's
AJ
awesome.
said Ashley stream soon, or yes, most likely. I'm not gonna commit to a date just yet. I need to we're finishing up a couple of videos that are all kind of happening for next week, and I want to get those done before a stream happens. But yes, we will be back in the streaming streets in March. So all of you guys that are constantly in the live stream chat, I miss you too, and I can't wait to get back into it.
Um, well, this wasn't what I was looking at, but Randy Buck said you're or sorry. Jason said how to best take the luck out of heads up. There's just gonna be luck in everything you play in the short term, and embracing it is like the most important thing for sure. And focusing on just playing your like feeling like you played well is really important.
Yeah. Trying to review all of the pieces of info that you had at the moment you made your decision and only base your rating or your review of your quality of play on that and not the results. All right, you guys. Thank you so much for all the participation chat. You guys are the best. See you guys later. I hope you got something out of it. Till next time, you guys. Bye.